It's all good. Okay. So Unit B, everybody ready? I know, right? They're obviously not wild population. Well, shot collars on. Okay. So study time. We're gonna go over Unit B. Unit B. When we're done here, I do have a handout that I'll bring to you so that you can have something to look at over the weekend and maybe make some notes on. So some key terms that you should probably know. BOD is biological oxygen demand, and it's just the amount of dissolved oxygen needed by aerobic biological organisms to break down organic material. Okay, geographic isolation we've talked about, so that just refers to a population of animals or other organisms that are separated from exchanging genetic material. And usually that might be some geographic feature that prevents them from getting together. Indicator species. Yeah, we did. Yeah, indicator species for water quality, but it could also be for any other environmental. Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. BOD is for water quality. Okay, indicator species, just looking at numbers and relative abundance of organisms to determine if an ecosystem is healthy. And that could be an aquatic ecosystem, but it could also be a terrestrial ecosystem. Like frogs are a really good indicator species because they have a life cycle in water and on land. And they have thin skin that's coated in water, right? They always have to be wet. So they're exposed to a lot more environmental toxins than other animals. So frogs make really good indicator species. Gradualism is one of the modern evolutionary theories that evolution proceeds by very small steps. So that was the one where you saw the birds, and there might have been a red one at the bottom, and then in the middle there was an orange one, and then at the top there was a yellow. So there's small changes to the organism over time. And of course, results in a different species. Another modern theory of evolution was punctuated equilibrium. And we use this theory to explain the fact that we're missing a lot of steps in our evidence for evolution, right? We're missing a lot of fossils, we're missing strata with nothing in them, basically. So it explains, punctuated equilibrium tries to explain that evolution can happen in a series of very large steps. And of course, evolution, what we've learned, really depends on environmental pressures, doesn't it? If there's no environmental pressure to change, then there's nothing acting, there's no natural selection that's going to act on various traits that an organism has. A jump. For a long time, there's one specific kind of bird, for example, and then all of a sudden you find two new species that appear to have evolved from that one. Yeah. Adaptation is a fairly straightforward concept. It's just an alteration in structure, function, behavior from an organism that gives them some sort of advantage. Spontaneous generation is a really old idea. And remember, this was Linnaeus believed in spontaneous generation, the idea that living things can arise from non-living matter. Okay, natural selection is the idea of nature selecting traits that allow organisms to be successful in their environment. They survive, they reproduce, they pass on their genes. And artificial selection is when humans decide on those desirable traits and they breed organisms specific for those traits. We use artificial selection as a piece of evidence for evolution because if humans can manipulate wild mustard and create broccoli and kale, then why couldn't a natural force do the same thing? Phylogeny, the term should be familiar to. All it is the evolutionary development. So we look at diagrams, like you might have a diagram of horse strata changing over time, like the horses used to be really, really small, miniature horses, and then different aspects of their body changed, like the length of their legs and their girth and whatnot. Okay, so the phylogeny is just showing that evolutionary tree sort of thing. how organisms start as one species and then evolve into different kinds of species. Okay, homology, the shared ancestry. So homologous structures are structures that evolutionary scientists look at for evidence of evolution. So they're structures that have an evolutionary history. They share a common ancestor. Whereas analogous structures are just, they have the same sort of function. I don't know. But they have nothing to do with evolution. They look at homology more than analogous structures, yes. For evidence that organisms are related. Yeah. Okay. Because our legs and the legs you might find on a monkey, well, I shouldn't use that example, but they're not really the same, right? Yeah. Well, they both, no, they both look at structures or especially in homology, similar gene patterns. We talked about that, right? Yeah, they both look at kind of the same thing, like structures, functions. Yeah. Biotic potential we talked about, and it's the ability, basically how many babies an organism can have in its lifetime. And it really depends on food supply, age of ability to reproduce, how many offspring are produced at one time, how often they can give birth in a year, sort of thing. Okay. Genetic variability makes sense. It's just the measure of a tendency of individual genotypes to vary from one another. So sexually reproducing organisms have a lot of genetic variability because of the nature of sexual reproduction, of course. And that genetic variability is what evolution acts on, right? If we didn't have those variations, then there would be no adaptations to environmental pressures. Mutation, we define it as any change that occurs in DNA. Okay, so these could be beneficial, they could be harmful, they could be neutral. And it also is important where the mutation occurs, because if the mutation does not occur in a sex cell, it can't be passed down. But if it does occur in a sex cell, this is a source of more variation in populations. I think that's just the way they grow, because that's just their storage site. It's not really a part of their body, really. Yeah. Selective pressure, I've asked that you know what this means, what it refers to. So any phenomena that alters behavior and fitness of living organisms is the driving force of evolution and natural selection. So examples of selective pressure right now would be climate change, right? If our climate is changing and it's getting warmer in some areas or colder in other areas, that's a selective pressure that forces the adaptations that help the organism survive to be passed on. Gain survival advantage, any factor in an organism's environment, health or physical development that gives it a benefit. Right? The word is self-explanatory. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so some concepts. Biological oxygen demand. Bless you. So if the biological oxygen demand is really high, that means that decomposers are using a lot of oxygen. That means there's a lot of decomposition. Typically means that it's not a healthy aquatic ecosystem, right? Because we've talked about algal blooms and how the rate of decomposition increases quite a bit, but it uses up all the oxygen. So then higher level organisms like fish are affected. So does that chart make sense? The higher the biological oxygen demand, the more decomposition. Algal bloom, we've talked about since grade 7, I'm pretty sure, right? Nutrients somehow flow into a water body and provide nutrients for algae, which overgrow and choke out the aquatic plants that normally would produce lots of oxygen, and then there's no sun getting below. Decomposition increases, and uses up oxygen, so then fish will die. If algal blooms get really bad, it can actually kill a water body. They're considered a dead lake or pond or whatever because nothing else grows. Okay, we know the layers and the zones of a lake. Oh no, littoral and limnetic. Dang it. So littoral, what's a good way to remember it? I'm not sure. If you have any ideas to help you remember the difference between littoral and limnetic, that would be great if you have some ideas. Okay. Litter closer to the land. You think little, it's a smaller area? Yep. Whatever helps you remember. And then limnetic is the open area where there's still light penetration. And of course, profundal is this zone here where there's no light penetration. And then the last one is the benthic zone, the very bottom where all of the decaying matter ends up, and there's benthic organisms living there. Yeah, you should have. Yeah. Until, exactly, yes. Well, the photic is the limnetic. The photic, photo, light, is where light can reach. Aphotic, no light. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, sustainability. We all know about sustainability, the sustainable use, using things at a rate so that they can continue. Layers of soil we didn't really talk a lot about, but we did talk about I'm pretty sure we talked about humus, how the humus is the decaying matter, right? Makes soil nice and rich. I think this is meant to be variation. Yeah, so just a picture of all kinds of bunnies, and they're all different from each other, and they all are different because of sexual reproduction. You should know density dependent, density independent factors. Okay, so density independent factors, they affect everybody in the population, regardless of size or density. So, um, natural disaster, weather, those would be density independent factors because weather is going to affect all of us. It doesn't matter how many there are of us, right? Whereas density dependent, it really depends on the size of a population. So very large populations that are very dense, disease will pass among them much more quickly. So competition, predation, parasitism, and disease are considered density dependent because if it's a very dense population, those will affect it more. Excuse me, sorry. Whereas Eric, he's really far away. It's not very dense in here, so I'm sick over here. Chances are he's not going to get sick because he's so far away, right? Okay, does that kind of help? Like, yeah. If you think of it, it doesn't matter where you are, it's going to affect everybody the same. Like a blanket effect, that's density independent. Sorry, did I go too far? A disease will, yeah, for example. And there will be more competition for resources because you would imagine there'd be less available for everybody. No, it could be low density. So these would not be driving factors for survival in a population that's not very dense or very large, right? Because there should be enough resources for everybody if it's not a huge population. Nothing really that I can think of. Predation maybe a little bit because it's easier to single out individuals in a population that's not very dense because you can just, pick one easily. Okay, good. So this says six kingdoms of life, but remember we learned it a little bit differently, didn't we? We talked about the three domains, and within the domain eukaryote, we talked about four kingdoms. Okay, so this graphic here is not really accurate, but what should you have? You should have the archaebacteria as one of the domains, right? And then we had the bacteria, or eubacteria is another range. And then we had the eukaryote as a third domain. You should know the archaebacteria, the eubacteria. I'm not asking you to remember specific examples, but know that they're there, right? Yeah. Archaebacteria, eubacteria, eukaryote. I think when we talked about it, we just called this eukaryote or eubacteria just bacteria. But yeah, they're both the same. So there's three domains, right? Archaebacteria, eubacteria, and then eukaryote. And then eukaryote, we divided into four kingdoms. Okay, so the protists, the fungi, the plants, the animals. They're another domain, yeah. No, they are a kingdom within the domain eukaryote. Yeah. Okay. Because remember, it used to be these four kingdoms: animals, plants, protists, and fungi, and Kingdom Monera. That's how you learned it in grade 9, right? But now Monera is such a huge kingdom that they took it out and made them into two domains. Because if you count all the living species that exist and that we believe have ever existed, the bacteria, archaea and eubacteria, outnumber them by far. Each with the four on the bottom is a kingdom, yes. They all fall into the domain eukaryote, yes. Archaebacteria and bacteria, yeah. Okay. All right, and understanding the idea of scientific names and how we classify and how it relates to how organisms are related to one another is important. So here's just a picture. The common name is the blue crab, and of course we have the two-name system from Carl Linnaeus, Calinectes sapidus. There's rules for writing scientific names, but of course the scientific name is the genus name and the species name. And I've talked to you before about how if an organism is within the same genus, it's more related. Right? So if they're in the same family but they have a different genus, then they'd be less related. Right? Yeah, because it's more specific. And I know in your practice test you had, wasn't it ducks or something? Yes, okay, some different birds. And you had to analyze and look at the names to determine how more closely related the different species were. Okay. Family or species? No, I don't think so. Because different genus would, like, they'd have to be in the same genus. Quite stretch. Okay, you should find it and then you can show me. And of course, who came up with the two-name system? Carl Linnaeus, right? Oh. Okay. Okay, ready? It's a huge graphic, theory of evolution. And remember just all the pieces that we have in favor of evolution. So we have biogeography, how we find organisms in certain areas that are very similar. We have biochemistry, where we can look at amino acid sequences and determine if organisms are related because they have sort of the same proteins. We can look at genetics. We can examine genetic code and see how related organisms are. We look at homologous features. Right? We look at the fossil record. Those are all pieces of evidence that evolution exists. Okay, so some of these are on this diagram here. So yeah. Molecular biology, fossil evidence, comparative anatomy, biogeography. And of course, artificial selection is also a piece of evidence, because if humans can adjust traits, why can't nature? Excuse me. I said if humans can adjust traits, why can't nature? Sorry. John, can you pass me my water? I'll share it with you guys. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, did that make sense, Lindsay? Did that make sense? Oh, no. Okay, so early evolutionary theory. Excuse me, Lamarck we have already talked about. He said that we could acquire traits throughout our lifetime that help us survive and then pass those on, right? And obviously that's not true. But it was a belief for a long time because we didn't know any different. Thomas Malthus, he was the mathematician. And all he really said was that he noticed that populations can increase in size until checked by the environment, right? So that there's a carrying capacity for all environments. And once that carrying capacity is reached, then organisms have to struggle to survive. And only the fittest would survive. Okay. So he was one person who influenced Darwin. Lyell we didn't talk about. I don't think you should. We don't need to know him. We didn't talk about Spencer, yeah. So the only one on this slide that you really should know, Lamarck, and then Malthus, right? He was just the mathematician. And of course, we'll talk about Darwin and Wallace. They sort of had the same idea, right? Yeah, it did on the other one, did it not? Okay. And then me talking, yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right, this is all just classification again. Lamarck's view, that you stretch your neck over time and then you get a longer neck. And then here's Darwin and Wallace. They believe that variations exist, and this is our current understanding of it, right? Variations exist, and the variation that helps an organism survive allows it to be more successful, so it will live longer, it will produce more children, pass on its genes. Okay. Yeah, same sort of thing. Okay. Theory of evolution, we've already talked about things that lead us to believe that it's true, right? So DNA evidence, homologies, and so on and so forth. Okay. The fossil record was one of our biggest. This is an example of everybody knows, a liger, right? So they can be produced artificially, and there was a scientist who believed that that's how organisms were produced by hybrids, right? Okay, so we know now that that's not true. Mutations can be neutral, harmful, beneficial. They are only valid, they only help evolution if they are in the germ cells, if they're in the sex cells. Okay, so sexual reproduction, we already understand the idea that it's sexual reproduction that allows us to mix up variations, mix up traits, and then the organisms that inherit those traits that allow them to survive will survive, live, have more children, and pass on those traits. And that's what evolution acts on, is those variations in our traits that came about by sexual reproduction. So according to modern evolutionary theory, it just says populations rather than individuals evolve. Individuals with favorable traits are more likely to survive and reproduce, and that's only if the variations are favorable. As a result, descended populations possess variations in greater frequency. So we looked at a lot of graphics with beetles, like the brown beetles and the green beetles, right? Okay, so we talked a little bit about variation exists, and if a variation helps an organism survive, like if they're camouflaged, then it'll be passed on. So this is a cladogram or phylogenetic tree on the right here, and it shows how related organisms are. The closer they are on the tree, the more closely related they would be. So here, according to this diagram, the turtle and leopard are more related than the lamprey and the leopard because they're closer together on the cladogram. Okay. Well, if you're talking lamprey and salamander, you would need more information to decide, because if that was a question, that wouldn't really be fair because it's still close to either one of those. Right? A tuna is related to a lamprey, but it's also related to salamander. And you'd have to say the turtle, yes. Or which two animals are not related, or the least related, yes. The lancelot and the leopard. Yeah. Okay. Was something like this on the practice test? Yeah. Oh, okay. Another example of a phylogenetic tree. This one's showing our history. Right? And of course, it's a lot more added to it since I found this picture, because they found, I think, at least 2 other fossils that they believe are different hominids in the last 5 years. I'm pretty sure. Hmm. So if it's the newest in evolutionary terms, it's on the right, because this is the ancestral species down in the bottom left. So when you're looking at it, the most recent would be the leopard. Yeah. Is the most what? Most evolved from. So if it's evolved from, you'd be going back. Because we evolved from monkeys, right? If you use that term, then it only gave you the forward ones. Which evolved from the beach. Okay, then you'd have to go forward. Yeah. And the those are most closely related. So yeah, the one that's closely related, yeah. 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 Okay. Um, yeah, no, that's not your test. I will make it much more difficult than 30 marks. Guaranteed. So that's all I have for there. I will go and get your handout for you, and it's got all of the outcomes. By going over this, I may have missed some of those points, so just read through it carefully and make sure you're taking notes on whatever we didn't get in here, and I will share this with you.